Okay, waiting room's off and I'm recording.
Thanks, Jess. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Social Exclusion Seminar, the first one of the term. We've got information on the website, but we've got another one next week, the 12th, and then another one again on the 26th. So please do sign up for those as well. My name is Laura Lane. I'm Policy Fellow here at LSE Housing and Communities within CASE, and I'm organising this seminars this term with Abigail McKnight, CASE Director. We're really happy to welcome Whitney Crenna-Jennings today from the Education Policy Institute, who's going to introduce herself shortly. But just a little bit of admin. The event is hybrid, so if you could please stay on mute throughout the presentation, and then either raise your hand or put something in the chat if you want to ask a question at the end. If you have any points of clarification, please just direct them to me, Laura Lane. I'll be in the chat as well. The session is going to be recorded just for the main presentation, and then we'll be turning that off for Q&A. So obviously, please keep your camera off if you don't wish to be recorded. I think that's it. So I will hand over to Whitney, who we're delighted to welcome today. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. And thanks to all the organizers of CASE seminars for inviting me to speak today. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everyone see a slideshow?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, great. Let me just get this started. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking about a report that we published towards the end of last year on children missing from education. And this is part of a broader program of work that we have at EPI, looking at the various ways in which children and young people get pushed out or lose contact with the education system through official means like suspension and permanent exclusion, and less official means like managed moves, off-rolling, things like that. So just a bit of an intro on EPI before I get started. We are a national charity research institute. We're very focused on increasing access to good education and good education outcomes for the most disadvantaged learners. So sort of under that, we have a program of work on mental health, wellbeing, and inclusion, which I lead. We do mainly a lot of work with data. We use government data covering all pupils in England, the National Pupil Database. And the goal of the work that we do is really to influence policy in an evidence-based way. So I'm going to start with our kind of state of knowledge about children missing from education before we embarked on this piece of research. I've used "from" in parentheses there because there is some confusion around terminology, which kind of just further muddies the waters around some of these estimates. So I'll try to be kind of clear throughout about what exactly I'm talking about, what groups of children I'm talking about. I'm going to go through our methodologies and estimates of 3 different groups of children. So those not in schools, those missing from education entirely. So this takes into account those who are in home education, but outside of formal provision. And our final group is pupils who are at one point registered in a state school, state education, but then go missing, leave the system for an unknown destination. And for this last group, because we have done an analysis that looks at individual pupils and follows them kind of through time, through primary school and secondary school, we have data that schools have collected on their social and demographic characteristics. So we can look at who they are, which groups are at increased risk of going missing, and kind of get a sense of what might be driving some of this missingness. And I'm going to finish up with 4 recommendations for government, for schools, for research, for the research that we've developed off the back of these findings. So in the last few years, there have been a number of organizations, think tanks, government departments, government bodies that have tried to estimate the number of children who are missing from education. And what you see here is a very kind of wide range of estimates, from 100,000 to about 250,000. And this is because they are using different sources of data, and because they're measuring slightly different things. So the Center for Social Justice, for example, in 2022 found that 100,000 children had disappeared from school. So they were on roll, they left. The local government association at the kind of higher end of the estimates found that 250 children were missing from education. So this is using data from local authorities about children who are not in education. And this is a pre-pandemic estimate as well. So I think another kind of fundamental reason why we have such a broad range of estimates is because there is no one good data source for this information, this piece of information on children missing from education. And related to that, even more fundamentally, is, we don't have a good sense of the number of children and young people who are in the country at any one period of time. ONS population estimates get revised pretty frequently up and down in response to, immigration estimates changing. If you look at kind of some years of data, and I'll get into this later in the presentation, you see that according to the ONS, there are fewer children in the country than there are registered in schools. So there's this disconnect here. So if we don't have that kind of denominator of the number of children and young people in the country, it's really hard to get a sense of who we might expect to see in schools and who is not there. And I'll also just highlight some work that the Children's Commissioner is doing on this issue. They have kind of a program of work on this issue of children going missing or children missing. And they do a lot of work with LAs trying to figure out where children who leave schools go. And they found that lots of local authorities don't have a good sense of how many children live in their area. So at the national level, at the local level, we don't have a good idea of this. And I'll also just kind of highlight some of the wider context for this research. This has really become, I think, an area of policy interest and focus, especially post-pandemic, as we have several kind of data markers that young people, particularly those from more disadvantaged backgrounds, are losing contact with the education system, are more absent. We see like higher absence rates post-pandemic, and survey evidence showing that young people feel less motivated, less excited about the future. That was immediately kind of post-pandemic, so that might have changed slightly, but essentially a kind of collection of data points suggesting that young people, in particularly those from disadvantaged or marginalized communities, are more at risk of kind of losing contact, going missing from education. So I just wanted to kind of, I thought this quotation from Rachel D'Souza, who is the current Children's Commissioner, kind of lays out some of the difficulties here with estimating the number of children missing from education, and also the government position on this issue. So there are hundreds of children that have never interacted with the education system. I personally think this is in the thousands, and we'll kind of get into that in the presentation. And there's also children who don't interact with any system, so not just the education system. The known unknowns includes those who have never been on a school roll, perhaps they've gone missing from care, they've been trafficked into the country. There should be no unknown children to the system. Policymakers, schools, NLAs must be able to identify and reach these children. And you'll see that position, I think, come through in the recent schools bill. I always forget the precise name of this, but schools and wellbeing bill, where one of the main kind of provisions is for a children not in school register. So the government is trying to get a better handle on this. So what did we do to kind of estimate the three different groups of children that I talked about earlier? So for the first group, children not in schools, very simply, what we did is look at the number registered with GPs, and we used that as kind of a proxy measure of the population of children and young people at different ages. We compared that to the number registered in schools, and the difference is, the number of children not in schools. Now, there are some issues with using GP records as kind of a proxy measure of the population, which I will get into. But there's a very kind of simple methodology here for a sort of broad upper bound estimate of the children not in schools. And we've used upper bound because there's issues around over-registration, I think, with the GP records, which I'll talk about, but there's also issues around under-registration as well. So we're not saying this is a definitive kind of figure, but it gives a sense, hopefully. For our second group, children missing from education, from that number of children not in schools that we derived through the first step, we've then subtracted those who are registered as being home educated. So they're registered with their local authority as being in home education. And this adds another layer of data issues because we don't have a perfect sense of the number of children who are in elective home education because parents, carers, are not legally required to register their child with their local authority. So some caveats here around using GP records. So I'll start with the reasons why we decided to use them. So essentially, we expect many young people and children to be in regular kind of contact with the healthcare system. People are encouraged to register with a GP to access primary healthcare. We know that some groups are going to be less likely to do this. So there's going to be bias that's one sort of source of bias. GP patient registration headcounts are released monthly, so we have much more kind of up-to-date data. And they're also updated to reflect deaths and other things as well. So on to kind of some of the problems here. Obviously, registration with GPs requires proactive action. You have to register with a GP. People might not be deregistering when they leave the country. Certain groups may be underrepresented due to moving around the country or concerns about stigma or discrimination in healthcare. But I will kind of get into why we thought this was a better option over the ONS population estimates in more detail as I go through. And then one more set of caveats before I get into our findings. I think it's just really important to highlight there are a lot of uncertainties here. So hopefully I'm not losing everyone's interest by kind of highlighting all these issues before I go into the findings. But essentially, we don't have one good source of information about the number of children in home education. We have some data from local authorities. It will be incomplete because not everyone is registering, but we've kind of used the data that we have to get a sense of who's in home education. And then our third group, this is much more straightforward because we're not using kind of national level headcounts. We're using individual pupil level data from the National Pupil Database from the Department for Education. And we're able to follow pupils from the point where they join the education system, for many of them that's reception, through to year 11, which we've done for 4 successive cohorts kind of pre and into the pandemic. And we can look at who is leaving the mainstream education system, who is moving into alternative provision, who is moving into the independent sector, and then those who are leaving and we just don't know where they go. We've also looked at a final kind of subgroup, those who leave for at least a term, but then reappear by year 11. So there's a bit of a disruption. They're missing some education for a period of time. On to our findings. So I'm going to start with children not in school. So as I said, very simple, we've compared GP records to school registration records. And what we see is in our latest year of data, so we've done 2017 to 2023 through the pandemic, we see that around 400,000 children are not in schools according to our methodology. So I've highlighted some of the kind of data issues, but I think the key takeaway here is we see quite a substantial change in the number over time. It grows by around 50%, and it's difficult to see what kind of systemic problems with the GP data might be driving this change, but very happy to discuss any reasons people might think this might be a kind of data issue. So we looked at how this varies by age because we had age breakdowns from 5 to 15. And interestingly, we see that from 2017 to 2023, the number of young people in older age groups, so adolescents who are not in schools, is growing. There's kind of a much stronger age effect in the more recent year of data, adolescents more likely to not be in schools. And I think we can draw some conclusions from the kind of wider evidence around why this might be. We know that young people's needs may become more complex as they get older. We know that more young people in older age groups are struggling with mental health issues from kind of the NHS prevalence data. And we know that schools in many cases are struggling to meet young people's needs. The SEND system is under a lot of pressure. We know that young people with mental health needs may struggle to access healthcare. So there's some indications of what might be driving this potential kind of trend over time. We also looked at the gender split, so gender and age split, which I think adds weight to the kind of mental health hypothesis here. You see that over time, girls in older age groups are more likely to be missing from schools. And this additionally is kind of backed up by some qualitative work that the Children's Commissioner's Office has done with LAs with parents who report that increasingly, you know, their children who have a mental health need, emotionally based school avoidance, are not kind of getting those needs met in school. So yeah, it's hard to say definitively what is driving these potential trends, but I think we have some ideas from the existing research. So then on to the number of children missing from education. So as I mentioned, we used existing estimates of children who are registered in home education. So we have a number of estimates from charities, from the government, and we've taken the kind of maximum, as we have kind of multiple estimates from different sources for the years in question. And we've taken the maximum because we know that these are likely to be underestimates, because not all young people who are in home education are going to be registered as such with the local authority. But you can see here, looking at the different kind of measures over time, there's been quite a substantial increase between 2017 to, I guess, 2024, about like a doubling of the number of young people registered as being in home education. So what are we left with when we take this into account? So this chart shows you the number of children missing from schools and how that's changed over time. That's our top line. If you take into account those in registered home education, we're left with those who may be missing from education entirely. They're not in formal provision, they're not in home education, and we see that according to our approach here, that number has increased by 40% since 2017. So I just wanted to highlight that we also checked what those estimates would look like if we used various ONS population estimates. So the top kind of green line here shows, our estimates using GP records and school records, our estimates of children missing from schools. If we use ONS population estimates instead of GP records as our kind of measure of the population, you'll see that whether they're census-based estimates, which is the yellow line, whether they are revised to take into account updated immigration figures, that's the red line, or whether they are the new method that the ONS uses, which is more using administrative-based data to kind of feed into population estimates, you'll see that in many years, there's actually fewer children who are registered in schools. So the number of children who are not in schools is a negative figure, which just doesn't make sense. It's implausible. So this kind of sense checking that we did, I think, reaffirmed our decision to use GP records as hopefully a more kind of accurate measure. So on to our final group of pupils. So as I mentioned earlier, we looked at four cohorts, so kind of pre and sort of into the pandemic. So these are cohorts who are finishing year 11 in the years on the x-axis of the chart here. So they're finishing in 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. We followed them from reception through to the spring term of year 11. And we found that between sort of 52 to 56,000, or, around kind of 55,000 are leaving schools, leaving the education system entirely for an unknown destination. So that is that red line there. That's the kind of main finding here. I know that colors in this chart aren't that easy to differentiate, but that is the key kind of takeaway here. And this accounts for about 8% of each cohort, so slightly under 1 in 10. It's a substantial number. I think it's important to point out that we are not accounting for young people who are leaving the country due to migration. We're just not able to do that. But we wanted to sort of highlight that might be an issue. So we included a potential kind of measure of migration-related exits, and that is the sort of bluish gray line that is second from the bottom of the chart. And this is a really, really rough, really fuzzy measure of migration-related exits. We used late entry to the system, so they're joining the English education system after reception, and they have English as an additional language as a kind of proxy of their migration status. And we find that, around 10,000, upwards of 10,000 with those characteristics are exiting the system in kind of each cohort. So it could be that about, a fifth of these exits are related to migration. It's really hard to say, but that is a factor here that I kind of wanted to highlight. I also would like to highlight the number of pupils who leave for a term, at least a term. They leave for a period of time and they return to a mainstream school by year 11, because I'm going to talk about those later. So that is the kind of dark green line right below the red line. And you see it's around 30,000, upwards of 30,000 who are missing a period of education, but then are coming back. So we wanted to see how this varies sort of year on year, or between kind of different years of the primary and secondary phase. So this is for our two kind of earlier cohorts, because those were the cohorts that we had kind of complete data for. We did some imputation for some of the later cohort figures, which I can get into if people are curious. But essentially what we see here is that the number of pupils who are exiting the system for an unknown destination stays quite steady through primary school at around kind of 4,000 in each year of primary. And we see a slight kind of spike in year 6 at the end of primary. But where you see a real change is through the secondary years. You see quite a drastic rise in the number who are going missing from education. And you'll see that there's a spike here in this chart in year 10. And I want to highlight that in year 11, we only looked at exits in the first part of the school year, so in the first term. Essentially, we were interested in who was on roll in the spring term of year 11, because it's those pupils that are going to count in, results for those schools. So that's why we kind of see a fall in year 11 here. We're not accounting for the whole year, but I think it's really important to note that a fifth of all exits happening throughout the cohorts are happening in year 10 in the lead up to GCSEs. Notable because obviously this is kind of a high stakes period. It's unlikely that this is all due to migration out of the country. We know off-rolling happens. We have a fair amount of anecdotal evidence. We know that mental health is something that's getting worse around this time. So I think this, this is a notable that we're seeing this spike in pupils leaving around this time period. So final kind of set of findings is looking at some of the inequalities, the disparities in terms of the groups of pupils that are more likely to go missing. So we tested, or we looked at breakdowns by gender, ethnicity, special educational needs, disadvantage represented by free school meal eligibility, experiences of being in care, so for care experienced children, and also pupils who are permanently excluded or suspended. I haven't included them all here. I've just pulled out the ones where we see a kind of stark difference. The full kind of chart looking at all the different groups is available in our report. But if we take the kind of 8% of the cohort overall that is leaving, and that we've looked, this is 2019, the kind of most recent pre-pandemic cohort for which we had a complete set of data, we see that boys and girls, not much difference there, which is slightly, different from, for example, gender inequalities in exclusion rates, where we see boys are much more likely. We found that in terms of ethnicity, traveler pupils and Gypsy Roma pupils were very likely to exit the system permanently at some point in primary and secondary school. We also found quite a high, relatively high proportion of white Irish and other white pupils leaving, potentially a Brexit effect, hard to say. And then in the other ethnic minority, global majority groups, we also saw a kind of slightly higher rate than the 8%. Difficult to say exactly what is driving this. Potentially migration is part of this picture. In terms of the other characteristics we looked at, we found that persistently disadvantaged pupils, so those who are eligible for free school meals for at least 80% of their time in school, were more than twice as likely to go missing. Also, pupils with profound and multiple learning difficulties were much more likely to go missing. This is a very small group, it's several hundred pupils, and it's likely that a lot of this is driven by kind of serious medical concerns. And finally, we found that care experienced pupils and those who were permanently excluded were more likely, considerably more likely to kind of go missing from the system permanently. And then some slight differences in the group of pupils who miss a period of education, but then come back. So we looked at the same set of characteristics, and we found that, interestingly, compared with the kind of 5% of the cohort overall, the sort of 30,000 that is leaving for a period and returning, we found that pupils from Black ethnic groups were much more likely to miss a period of education and return, we found that those with social, emotional, and mental health difficulties and care experienced children were much more likely to miss some education, but then kind of come back and be in a school by year 11. And additionally, those who were permanently excluded were much more likely to miss a period of education. This is likely related to the fact that they are, they're excluded from a school. Perhaps the local authority is not doing a good job of finding provision for them within the 5 or 6 days that they are statutorily meant to. So that is probably part of the picture there. But I think all of this to say that it's the pupils that are kind of already at risk of poor outcomes, already sort of marginalized in education and societally, that are more at risk of leaving the education system entirely or missing a period of education in a mainstream school. So on to the kind of recommendations, the 4 recommendations that we developed off the back of these findings. So the first is in response to plans to create a register of children not in school. So as an organization, I think we're behind this from a safeguarding perspective. I think arguably it's a good idea to have a sense of where children are for their safety, for their well-being. I think there are doubts around the extent to which a register is going to solve this issue. I don't know how it's necessarily going to be enforced, and there are kind of concerns there. But we do have, existing administrative data across education systems, health systems, local authorities that we could be linking to kind of follow children and young people through systems. They drop out from one system, we see them in another system. So there could be, more extensive plans, I think, to achieve this goal. The second recommendation is a very straightforward one. Schools currently, if a pupil leaves their role, they are required to report that to the local authority, and the local authority has some duty to kind of follow up to see where that child goes. This data doesn't feed up centrally to DFE, as far as I know. We can't see it as external researchers. So if we had this data on reasons for why pupils are leaving, this would introduce a whole, other level of kind of transparency and oversight to this issue, which I think would be, is much needed. The third one is around how to ensure that all young people with different sort of sets of needs can access a good education, even if that's outside of formal provision. And I think we just don't know best practices for engaging children, providing for them, for that group that's at risk of kind of losing contact with the education system. And finally, we have a recommendation for just the kind of accuracy of government data. And this is some, ONS data, specific to ONS data, but I think this is an issue more widely around kind of NHS data, access to mental health care for children. We know that there are a lot of kind of gaps in data that prevent a full understanding of issues, prevent good resource allocation. So that is something that obviously really came through with this piece of research. So I'll wrap up there. Hopefully that wasn't too much of a whirlwind, too much information, but I'm happy to answer any questions or respond to any comments if people have them.